Hey everybody. We're going to take a quick look at our ribs and sternum. Before we jump into the actual structures and things, I just wanted to take a second to talk about the actual ribs and the rib cage itself. We have 12 pairs of ribs. They start with your first rib here, which is essentially flat in the transverse plane, and then we go all the way down to your 12th rib. Ribs 11 and 12 are called floating ribs. You can see the tip of rib 11 and 12 both right there. What floating ribs mean is they don't actually connect to the sternum. The ends of the shaft are actually floating. Ribs 1 through 10 are connected to the manubrium or body of the sternum through some costal cartilage. We have a couple structures actually to label here. We have these two openings. We have the superior aperture. We have all kinds of vessels and your esophagus and trachea and all sort of things go through there. And then we have your inferior aperture, which is the opening below, and then superior is the opening above. So let's go ahead and look at our sternum. It's made up of three parts. It kind of looks like a sword, I guess. So they refer to the manubrium as being the handle of the sword, and the body or is the actual blade of the sword. So let's label the jugular notch. It's located right here. Now, I've always seen this referred to as a jugular notch, but I had a question on my national board exam that referred to this as the suprasternal notch. So there are other names for it. We'll be using jugular notch. Here we even call it a sternal notch. Any of those are acceptable. And then next to the jugular notch, we have the clavicular notches for the, you guessed it, clavicles. So the sternal facets of the clavicles articulate here with the clavicular notches. Now we get into our costal facets. There's 7 of them for the 7 ribs that attach directly to the sternum. Ribs 8, 9, and 10 attach through a more complicated cartilaginous attachment. They all, except for ribs 11 and 12, they all eventually attach to the sternum, but 2 through 7 attach directly. I'm sorry, 1 through 7 attach directly. The costal facets for rib 1 and 2 are actually on the manubrium, so we can go ahead and label those. Here's number 1. And I'm going to write a number 2 here, but I'm going to write 2A. Yes, that is an A. So 1 and 2A. Because only half of rib 2 attaches to the manubrium. The rest of, the other half here I'll label 2B because these two together are where rib 2 attaches. That's why costal facet 2 is listed in both the manubrium and the body. So let's go ahead and label the rest. So there's 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So costal facets 1 through 7, all labeled there. And I skipped the sternal angle. We can't see it in this view, but if I were to draw the manubrium and the sternum from a lateral view, this angle right here is called the sternal angle. So I'll write SA. Body, we labeled the costal facets already, and then lastly, we have the xiphoid process right here. And if rib 7 were attached here, there would be an angle between the xiphoid process and rib 7, or a notch rather. That notch is called the infrasternal notch. And that's it for the sternum. We'll go ahead and look at some ribs. We have 12 pairs of ribs. They all have a head and a neck. So let's go ahead and label the head and the neck. And then we have superior and inferior demifacet. So here's the superior demifacet and the inferior demifacet. So it's kind of like this little wedge, right? So if you picture, I don't think I'd advise you drawing this. It probably won't look good for me or you. So let's say we have two vertebral bodies here. Remember, the vertebral demifacets are on the vertebral bodies. Okay, so and then let me draw. I kind of messed up here. Let me draw and draw it with the demifacets in place. So this here is an inferior costovertebral demifacet, and this is a superior costovertebral demifacet. Then the rib comes in and attaches like that, sort of, this little wedge right here. So that means the superior demifacet of the rib articulates with the inferior demifacet of this vertebral body, and the inferior demifacet of the rib articulates with the superior demifacet of this vertebral body. So it gets a little confusing, but anyway, you can kind of see how that whole relationship works right there. So I'm sorry, I didn't color code here. So superior demifacet was pink, and inferior demifacet was orange. We've got the neck. Okay, now we have this idea of the articulating and the non-articulating tubercle. This refers to a rib's attachment with the costotransverse facet on the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae. So let's go ahead and circle this here. That is the articulating tubercle. It's very smooth if you were to see it in lab, and that's because it's articulating with the costotransverse facet directly, so it needs to be smooth. You don't want rough articulating partners. The non-articulating the non-articulating tubercle is actually a ligament attachment. So the ligament tugs on it your whole life and it leaves a mark on the bone. It's right there. So if we look right here, that is the juncture between the articulating tubercle and the costotransverse facet. We can't really see that attachment because there's a ligament in the way. That ligament is what attaches here. So the articulating tubercle is smooth and it articulates with the costotransverse facet. The non-articulating tubercle is rough. It doesn't articulate with anything. It's a ligament attachment. And let's label it purple. The shaft of the rib is the whole big area. So I'm just going to write shaft. And then, it continues. It's this whole thing. Or body, it can be called. Angle is specifically right there. That's the angle, this area, where there's an angle. And let's call that H, which is that's the letter we have next to the angle here. Costal cartilage, there's going to be cartilage. Some of the bones in lab actually still have them attached, but there's going to be a little piece of cartilage right there. I put an I there. That's not a bony structure, that's some cartilage that the rib uses to attach to the sternum. The costal groove is this groove right here. And there's a vein, artery, and nerve that run in that groove. And you can actually even see a little bit of it in this inferior view right there. And it is visible on a real rib. The bone gets really thin, and it's a little groove for vein, artery, and nerve. Nutrient foramen, you can cross off. We're not going to quiz on that or anything. It's a little tiny hole that every rib has, or maybe more than one, that allows blood vessels to enter and exit the rib. Superior and inferior borders. The inferior border of a rib is really sharp. This piece right there, and that really helps you tell the top from the bottom, because you find that sharp inferior border and know that should be pointing down, and then it's easier for you to tell if a rib is a left or a right. be prepared for that on quizzes to be able to differentiate between lefts and rights of things. I'll try to show you as much of that as I can in our 3D videos. That's the inferior border. The superior border we'll use yellow for, I guess. That's the superior border. And I guess we could take green and color in the inferior border as well. Okay, so inferior border green, superior is yellow. And then we have our inner and outer surfaces. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We don't need to label it necessarily, but this would be the inner surface and the outer surface. So this would be inner surface, that would be outer. Okay. And that brings us to our last slide. We have a couple ribs that are a little different. Not all ribs are obviously the same. They're bigger, smaller, different structures. Rib 1 and rib 2 are probably the most different, so we have them here. Rib 1 is very small. It's almost perfect. It's perfectly horizontal. Most of the ribs have an inner and outer surface. This one doesn't. It has a top and a bottom. You can actually touch your rib 1. It's not very far under your skin. It's right where your neck meets, right where you imagine your neck meeting your body, back behind your clavicle. If you were to push down, it'd be pretty tender, get right against the side of your neck where your scalene muscles are, and push down, and it's not going to be comfortable. If I ever had the opportunity to see you guys in lab when all this quarantine stuff is over, I can show you, and it's pretty sensitive. A lot of us don't have the best posture, myself included, and so our scalenes kind of pull up on that rib and gets all inflamed. And anyway, but the point is, it's the smallest, the shortest, and is horizontal. It has a tubercle for one of your scalenes on it, which we were just mentioning, and it's this tiny little bump right there. That's the scalene tubercle. It then has a groove for the subclavian artery, which comes out and over your first rib. Did I say scalene artery? I hope I said subclavian artery. And then it has this groove for subclavian vein as well. Red and blue. It has a complete facet. What that means is it doesn't have demifacets. It has a complete facet that articulates with a complete costovertebral facet on your thoracic vertebra. It does have an articulating tubercle that articulates with the costotransverse facet on your thoracic vertebra. Rib 2 is also small. It's bigger than rib 1, about twice the size. Now its interesting structure here, this one is, I love anatomy words. Tuberosity for the second digitation of serratus anterior. So eventually we'll learn about a muscle called serratus anterior, which helps abduct your scapulae. It's right here. It has digitations or fingers that attach to different ribs and different structures. So the second digitation of serratus anterior attaches right there. This rib has demifacets, which we're not really going to be able to label very well, but say we have a superior. This is a superior view, so really this whole area could be superior. And then inferior is going to be down below, so we're not going to really be able to see those here, but it does have demifacets, not a complete facet. And then it has an articulating tubercle as well. Right there. Articulating tubercle. Ribs 11 and 12, I don't have pictures of. I just included them here because they are floating ribs. So if you want to write that, they're floating. I won't spell it out. They're floating ribs. They don't attach to your sternum. And guys, that's it. Ribs and sternum. Thanks.